historically was really because they didn't have the resources to learn. That was one main reason. They didn't have access to learn. Travel was too hard, and it was really requiring a lot of money. So it wasn't that they weren't caring about ilm, at least the women. It wasn't meaning that. It was really hard on them to actually travel. It was too much on their body, and it was too much even in terms of time. And definitely their social dynamic couldn't afford it. And what I mean by social dynamic couldn't afford it is that she's a mother, she's got her kids with her. It's going to be really hard for her to travel all these distances with children that are vulnerable, that need time, that need focus. She's going to be needing to be nursing. And of course, her biological changes compared to the differences between her and a man's body can sometimes be an obstacle as well. And I always say women have five hardships or five major, let me say, call them challenges, versus men actually have three challenges or even two challenges. The challenges that men have are usually number one, their own enthusiasm, two, money. Women, on the other hand, she's got the challenge of number one, her own body is a challenge because her own body, one, she's going through hormonal changes. She's going through, of course, her physical changes, body changes based on the different circumstance that she's going through. It could be pregnancy, it could be nursing, it could be marriage. All of that is basically going to be bringing in an impact on her ability to seek him. And number three, husband can be a challenge because he could either be with you and giving you the support, or he could be a person that feels that I'm supposed to be the center and therefore you should be not busy away doing your things and seeking talab al-ilm. The children can be a challenge, and you never know what to expect from the children. Every single stage in their life can be different, and where a toddler is different than when they're older than that, and it becomes sometimes a challenge because when you're giving the children that focus, uh, it takes away from your ability to focus on your education as well, or even giving that. And number five, certainly money. And the part about money can be, how do I actually get the money as a resource to pay for the education and to also get the privilege to, one, get the time, get the money, and get the enthusiasm. So that's why I always say, sisters, if you have the resource and if it's available, like with this Gems of Light, it's available and you can actually find it, and join even while you're working at home, while you're washing the dishes, while you're, I don't know, cleaning around the house, etc. And even if you didn't want everybody else hearing and getting annoyed and just getting distracted from what they're probably doing, you could buy these headphones, and some of them are really cheap, so not necessarily expensive. So alhamdulillah, I mean, right now we really have access to talab al-ilm. So make use of it, and definitely, abuse talab al-ilm. And right now that you have those opportunities to actually learn and focus, what more do we want? All right, so let's go back to what we were doing yesterday. We went into certain details yesterday in terms of course, خذوا حذركم, because the subject was shifting from obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger, and speaking about that side, to then shifting to speaking about jihad. And we talked about jihad, and we said that there are many reasons for jihad. Most importantly, number one, I think one thing is, yesterday I was reviewing what I was talking about. One thing I did forget to mention is that there was a development and an evolution, I would say, within within the meaning and the motive behind jihad. In the early times of Islam, the first time in the early periods of Islam way up until probably the second year Hijrah. So we're looking at 12 years and then 2 years, so 12 years and 9 months almost, 12 years in Mecca. The Muslims were ordered not to do jihad, not engage in any, not even retaliation, in any combatant action, and not engage in any form any form of fighting whatsoever. So that was first in the early, um, the first in the early times in Islam. That was their jihad. So their jihad was really to be patient in really enduring the persecution that they were facing, and not engage in any type or shape or form in retaliation. Versus after the second year Hijrah, which is during the time of course, when the Muslims were already in Medina, so they migrated to Medina, then that brought in the shift. And the shift, that was the first ayah ever to be revealed about jihad. And it was really in order to protect the vulnerable, to protect those that were weak, to protect those that were persecuted. And certainly the first ayah ever to be revealed was the ayah in Surah Al-Hajj, that within الذين يقاتلون بأنهم ظلموا وإن الله على نصرهم لقدير. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given the permission, now, why the permission? Because they were the ones that actually asked for it. They're the ones that requested that they would fight in retaliation for the persecution that they had faced and are still facing. So that's when that ayah, وَذِنْ الَّذِينَ يَقَاتِلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically capable of giving them victory. So that was the first ayah, which is really similar to this ayah right there, in where it's basically emphasizing that the main reason for jihad was وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالْمُسْتَضْعَفِينَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ وَالنِّسَاءِ, that it was really to focus on supporting those that were basically persecuted and those that couldn't protect their religion and protect, at least staying steadfast for their religion. The second stage was the stage in where it's beyond, let's call it social justice. It's beyond social justice, but it is a form and a way of removing the obstacles that were causing a threat to the Muslim community growth. So when you look at the Byzantine Empire didn't yet attack the Muslims, at least in the early times. Well, let me take that back, because they did kill the convoy. They did actually kill the ambassador. That was, well, he wasn't an ambassador, he was more of a convoy, he was more of a person that was coming in with a message from the Prophet ﷺ. He did kill him, and that was considered international law, that was an attack, and an attack on the person that had actually sent you that note, at least whatever governance. So that was considered an attack. That was considered a threat. So the second stage in Islam was really to protect the Muslim Ummah at the time. So now it wasn't now we moved from protecting those that were vulnerable, or those that needed social justice, to then going to other stage, which is protecting the community at large. Okay, the community, Medina at large, because now you started having different groups, different countries. So we're looking at Persia, who actually had sent different spies to basically tell the Prophet ﷺ directly. The spies, and of course, sent Badhan ibn Sasan. And let me just say a little story about Badhan ibn Sasan. So Badhan ibn Sasan was basically leading on behalf of the Persian Empire. Badhan ibn Sasan was in Yemen. But then Ibn Sasan was basically a deputy for the Persian Empire, ruling on behalf of the Persian Empire in Yemen. But then Ibn Sasan hears, of course, he gets the information, gets the commandment that he needs to send to the Prophet ﷺ, that to the Prophet ﷺ that he has to surrender to the Persian Empire, and that if he doesn't, then that would actually mean he has to prepare himself for a war, because the Persian Empire at the time considered that, wait a minute, this territory is supposed to be belonging either to us or the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire was the bordering empire to the Persian Empire, at least from the northern side. And the communities or the tribes that were living in the Arabian Peninsula were basically, let's call them these Bedouins, that sometimes they would be under Byzantine rule and sometimes they would be under Persian rule. So it was really these two supreme and superpowers that were really overcoming, and it depends on who's actually winning at that time. So then those Arabi tribes were really, shifting from one superpower to another. But these superpowers, of course, they would recognize that whenever there is another, at least probably the birth or even the beginning of another, not necessarily superpower, but any group, any nation, any basically governance, or any, let's call it at least a division away from the superpower, they would basically seek it or consider it as a future threat that they have to suppress. Okay, so that's when they give themselves the justification to attack whatever growing nation, whatever future threat it might be, because they want to maintain their superpower, at least autonomy. Now, but then Ibn Sasan, the Persian Empire basically sends, like I said, to the deputy that they have to tell the Prophet ﷺ, you have basically the opportunity to right now surrender, or will make you surrender. So it's basically either war or you're going to surrender peacefully. And right now that you are basically part and subordinating yourself to the Persian Empire. But then Ibn Sasan sends these two convoys basically, and the Prophet ﷺ tells them to come back tomorrow. They come back the second day, and then the Prophet ﷺ tells these two convoys, that is, but then Ibn Sasan, the person that sent you, the deputy that sent you, that their king had died or had been killed, and tell Badan Ibn Sasan that if he becomes Muslim, he'll control what is under his feet. In other words, he'll continue to be the deputy, but this time not on behalf of the Persian king, but on behalf of the Prophet ﷺ. Or if he doesn't surrender, then in that situation, he's going to have to prepare himself that when the Muslims expand their territory, that he will be basically considered as a threat. Now, that's a second stage. Now, but what happened? But then Ibn Sasan, when, of course, these two convoys came back, when they me as a deputy, I didn't get any of such information. How is it, and how would he dare to actually bring such an information which dates almost 2 months back? It dates almost 2 months back, or at least a month and a half back. And when he, as a deputy, didn't even get this, let's call it a very private and a complete and a secret information, and a very high intelligence, even before me as a deputy even gets such information. And of course, the most let's call it at the time, it was considered the most sophisticated way of tracking or even passing on information from one country to another or one area to another. The fastest means of telecommunications at the time was really one person would stand at one corner and then would yell out the information to another corner, and then the person would, that's exactly how they did it. So it was basically, me yelling out, the other person yelling out, and the other person yelling out until it basically would get to Bathan ibn Sasan, which would almost take 2 months. But here the Prophet ﷺ basically told them to come back the second day. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ, according to Bathan ibn Sasan's calculation, the Prophet ﷺ knew that information instantly. So Bathan ibn Sasan, based on his calculations, that since the Prophet ﷺ, these two people, it took him almost 2 months to get there, he still didn't get the information. It was going to be basically backtracked, and he waited a whole week because he was basically backtracking the information that might have actually reached him to discover that what the Prophet ﷺ had said was actually true, and that it actually was given to him through a revelation. So Bathan ibn Sasan becomes Muslim. Now that's a real change. Bathan ibn Sasan becomes Muslim, and of course, being him, or him being in deputy, him being in power, that basically means that this gives an opportunity for the Muslims to expand their territory. And certainly you didn't necessarily have things that easy for all the times. So when you looked at, for example, in case of Byzantine Empire, the situation was different because the Byzantine Empire was literally, number one, it killed the deputy, the convoy. The number two, it basically was preparing to attack the Muslim presence in Medina anyways, because it was seeing that this might actually be a growing territory, a growing threat, and therefore they wanted to make sure that they would face the Muslims. That's what happened during the Battle of Tabuk. But the Prophet ﷺ was doing a lot of jihad, and this is the third stage of speaking about what I would call it like a development, even in how and what jihad really stands for. So the second stage of development for jihad is that it wasn't basically protecting the territory only, or at least those that belonged and are part of the Muslim nation at the time, but it was going through doing somewhat of a war even before it sometimes happens. So in other words, what does that mean? So basically they would anticipate that there is a group, and if there is a group that is basically gathering a threat, that is a coming threat, exactly like what was his name? Forgot his name, but don't worry, it'll get there, inshallah. Sorry, when you're dehydrated, your brain is not actually getting there. All right. So it's coming in. It's coming in. The name is coming in. Hold on. The name is coming in. Anyhow, okay, here we go. Thumama ibn Athal. Thumama, basically, it was a different story, so that's another stage of jihad. Thumama was basically holding a whole kingdom in Oman. But again, Thumama himself was, of course, leading different wars. But the Prophet ﷺ, of course, even though he was considered as not a bordering country to Oman, but they were still going and preparing and sending some guys to basically get intelligence information, to sometimes attack here and there. So the Prophet ﷺ would oftentimes send some Sahaba, even, and those are called siyar. or Ghazawat, sorry. Saraya, sorry, not Sir, but Saraya. All right, so Sariya, so you could see I'm not focused now. Sariya would be different than a Ghazwa. So this is a Sariya, and what a Sariya would be is that the Prophet ﷺ is not there, he's not joining with the group, and he would send off these Sahaba, and these Sahaba would do what is considered let's call it a mini battle. And this Seriya would really try to stop and sometimes to basically, um, basically, let's say, put an obstacle towards future challenges. Okay, so it's not a proxy war, but it's anticipating that they are right there bringing and thinking of terrorizing the Muslims, so they would come in with a saraya and actually go face these future people that are right there, actually on their way and even doing and preparing for the battle. So it was basically taking that, taking in, I would say, the anticipation and making that Sariya right there. So Thumamat ibn Adhan was rather quite different. So Thumamat ibn Adhan was this king in Oman, and when the Sahaba had went for the Sariya, it was really supposed to be there, basically right there in a battle with soldiers, but then they take one of these people as hostage. The Sahaba didn't really know. They thought that this man that they had taken as hostage was really nothing but a soldier, just a random soldier, probably not even a high-ranking soldier. But then when he was brought, the Prophet ﷺ got the revelation that this was actually the king himself. That was like, whoa, they actually got that king himself. So he was tied up in, of course, in the masjid. So the Prophet ﷺ comes to Thumama and says, Thumama, how are you? How are you doing? And Thumama says, إن تقتل ذا دم وإن تعفو عن شاكر وإن تسأل تعطى. He said, if you were to kill me, you know that I basically have, you know, my position now, you know who I am, in other words, but you know very well that I basically am considered of a high-ranking official, and if you kill me, you know very well that they will come back to retaliate for my blood. Basically, that's it. But he was just saying it in brief. He's a king. In taqtul taqtul dadam. If you kill, I've got blood, and you'll have blood on your hands, and you know very well what that means. I'm going to have a whole army coming to retaliate for me. And he said, and if you were to ask for a ransom, you will basically get it. I'm the king, basically. We'll basically figure out a good ransom to basically give it to you. If you were to forgive, will basically, and let go and release me, will basically be thankful. The Prophet didn't say anything. The second day he comes, Thumama, how's it going? Again. He said the same exact thing. In taqtul taqtul ذا دم وإن تعفو عن شاكر وإن تسأل تعطى. If you kill, you got blood on your hands. If you forgive, we'll be thankful. You ask for a ransom, تسأل تعطى, we'll give it to you. Third day he came, same thing. He said the same thing, and the Prophet said they said the same thing. The Prophet basically, what does he do? He releases Thumama. Thumama, when he was released, he went, took a shower, I guess wore something good, went to the Prophet and said, by Allah, you were the most person I hated, and now you're the most beloved person to me. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. He became Muslim. This is the king. Then he asked the Prophet ﷺ if he can actually go to Umrah. But of course, to go to Umrah, the Muslims yet didn't go. And to go to Umrah was actually going to be meaning that you're going to be announcing your Islam right there in the midst of a very dangerous city, Mecca. The Prophet ﷺ basically gave him the permission. You want to go do it, go do it. But of course, we're not going to be capable of protecting you because you say that we're really barely making it, in other words. When Thumama went to Mecca, he was saying, Labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika laka labbaik. And what happened? The people around in Mecca, they noticed that you're not saying it the way we say it. You're saying it based on Sabi'a way. You're saying it based on the Sabi'a, basically the Zoroastrians, but they actually used to think that the Muslims were Zoroastrians. So they would basically, or Magian actually, Sabi'a is Magian. So they started then looking at him, staring at him, and then eventually from staring to attacking. So they started beating him left and right until one basically somebody recognizes that you guys are actually attacking a king here. Do you know what you're doing? So that's when they let him go because they noticed that this is a very, very important person. Let him go and he continued his umrah there. It isn't until he goes back to, of course, Oman. But then, because the Prophet ﷺ was persecuted from Mecca, and you want to keep in mind that Mecca is a non-fertile area, so they depended a lot on the imported goods, important produce that was actually coming from Oman. So when, of course, right now the king of Oman is Muslim, so what does that mean? That was going to mean that the king of Oman, in support of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina, was going to basically use the import or the exported good from their area as a means, as a method to pressure the people of Mecca. So what he did was sanction and stop exporting goods from his end to Mecca. What did that lead to? That led to famine, that led to the lack of foods in Mecca. So they started begging the Prophet ﷺ to tell Thumam ibn Uthal in order to actually give the order for Thumama to export the produce and the goods because the people in Mecca are dying of hunger. And certainly the Prophet ﷺ gave that order to Thumama, give them foods. Basically that, and export the foods for them because they're dying of hunger. All right. Now the fourth stage, okay, so this is just an idea of how in the different stages of jihad. So we're talking about from one, protecting those that are in need of protection, to stage two, protecting the community in need of protection, and stage number three, even going and anticipating danger and actually stopping it before it even comes at them. So this is stage three and stage four, basically. Stage five was actually going into a higher rank of jihad, which was to basically go beyond than just those areas that are probably being, let's call them a military or a political threat, into considering that no, your duty is to make sure that you are a superpower that is giving the opportunity, the safety, and certainly the security for those that want to preach Islam, those that want to become Muslim, and those that basically want to practice their Islam, that they would have the security, they would have the support, they would have the resources to practice their Islam. So it was now meaning this is not speaking about combatants that are alone, or at least combatants that belong to a country, but this is actually speaking about the country itself. Any power, any superpower that is right there, not only attacking the Muslims, but also here being a superpower to stand against the Muslim power, was considered that you were supposed to be getting yourself ready in order to make sure that this superpower doesn't defeat and doesn't overcome, and certainly does not use their power to defeat the Muslim power. And what we mean by Muslim power here is, number one, the Muslim aqidah, the Muslim definition of social justice, and certainly the principles of Islam, and certainly, of course, the Muslim citizens. So now we're looking at the final stage was actually going into a stage where you are going into, let's call it, demand, a force, a superpower, that you're really making sure that you yourself are a superpower that basically defines and make sure that social justice, the principles of Allah Almighty, the citizens are all protected. So that's actually going to the farthest level, which is, of course, right now during our times, this is what all countries would practice. This is not, for those that don't know about politics, this is what every single country would practice. So whether we're talking about China, whether we're talking about Russia, whether we're talking about the US, or even NATO, they all work in the same way, where basically it's to make sure that their superpowers, they would basically set what is the definition of one, human rights, what the definition is for basically their security. So they would have all these military bases and even grow in their basically powers, and certainly in their political powers, and in, of course, in protecting their citizens, protecting their ideas also. I think this is important to mention. So this is not only in protecting the resources, but also protecting the ideas. But in Islam, of course, Islam, like any other country, believes in the same way, in where you have to make sure that your definition, because you cannot contradict yourself. You cannot contradict yourself and believe that justice is in a certain way. In other words, an injustice is in a certain way, and still accept that injustice is happening on ground, and just look at it and think that it's okay to leave it that way, even if they are not Muslim. And same thing when we're talking about ideas, that you are basically sharing your ideas, passing your ideas. But there is I would say, a debate between the scholars in where that jihad al-talab and jihad al-dafa, on whether all the Muslim expansion throughout history, on whether it was really just jihad al-talab, because jihad al-talab was defense jihad, and throughout history, most jihad, from what we know, was actually defense. It was defense, and not really the type of jihad where you're actually anticipating and attacking. But then, of course, we're speaking about different, different areas and so many different spaces. We're talking about the most expansive country ever and territory and ever to be basically ruling, was basically the Uthmani Khilafah, or it's all basically Muslim empire. So the Muslim empire reached all the way from Austria all the way to the borders of China. So this is considered the largest ever superpower to ever exist, period. from all the way from Austria, which would actually include Europe, all the way to the borders of China. In fact, even China had actually paid the jizya to the Muslims. India was under Muslim rule for over 400 years, or was it 800, 400 years? And of course, the Uthmani Empire was really basically, yes, extending back the Khilafah al-Islamiyah. Basically, we're talking about, yes, the Mamalik were before them, and then before them were basically Ayyubiyin, and then later, of course, you've got these different groups for these different basically countries. They were really countries, but they had pledged to the Khilafah al-Abbasiyah. But in practice, they were really making their own country. All right, so we're talking about areas in Uzbekistan, areas of Kazakhstan, Iran, etc. But even if you're talking about, for example, the Salajiqa, they actually pledged to the main Khalifa in Baghdad. And of course, 656 marks a very important date, which is when the Mongols had invaded al-Khilafah al-Abbasiyah, and that was really a shift in Islamic history. And of course, before that, if we would put in our calendars, so the Prophet ﷺ dies 11-year Hijrah, the Khulafa al-Rashidin, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq rules for 2 years, Umar al-Khattab for 13, and Uthman Affan for 8, Ali ibn Abi Talib for a year and something, so basically until 41-year Hijriya. 40-year Hijriya is when Ali ibn Abi Talib is killed, and then later 41-year Hijriya, of course, marks when Amul Jama'ah, when Hassan ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib basically decides and makes the final decision that he doesn't want to go and take the Muslim Ummah in more battles. So basically steps down to wanting to be the Khalifa and let Mu'awiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. So that marks the transition, I guess, and the start of al-Khilafah al-Umayyah, which basically started out in 41-year Hijriya and continues all the way to 132. From 132 Hijriya, and then you're going, maybe we could actually write that down so you could all remember it, right? So we've got 11-year Hijriya, 11-year Hijrah, the death of the Prophet ﷺ, and Khilafah was from, you want to consider it, 11 to 41, all right? That's Khilafah al-Rashida, basically Khilafah al-Rashidin. And then you had from basically 41 to 132 was the Umayyad Khilafah, and then 132 to 656 Hijriya was the Abbasid. So maybe we can the Abbasid Khilafah, and then you had from 656, well, it wasn't 656. So 656 basically you had the Umayyad, the Mongol invasion. And later, of course, you started having it was first the Ayyubid, okay, the Ayyubid, and then you had the Mamalik, and of course the then Uthmani, basically in 923-year Hijrah. And of course the end of Khilafah, basically March 23, 1924. And of course this is 1924, this is not Hijri. Now we're speaking about Gregorian calendar. Okay, this is when, of course, marks the end of Khilafah, with Kemal Ataturk actually bringing an end to Khilafah. And all right, so this is just a little history. When you look at all these, that's why scholars had differences of opinions when you're looking at all these. And of course, what would be considered as really a reference is not the behavior of al-mutawakkil, some kind of a khalifa, because that isn't necessarily what we would go back to in order to consider something as an Islamic resource, but we would go back all the way to one, basically the Prophet and even the Khulafa al-Rashidin to basically to mark for us and determine for us whether al-jihad can be dafa' or defense, or also can be anticipating, or at least some war in where the battles could also be by anticipating that there's going to be a coming threat, that we would engage in basically a battle before it even comes to us. All right, so which is basically jihad, jihad al-talab. All right, so basically that type of jihad. So that's where the scholars had differences of opinions on whether there is or not. Did such a thing happen in Muslim history, in where they, by the sword, basically and attacked, etc. So there are certain khalifas, like al-Mutawakkil, I guess, that al-Mutawakkil, and there are also a couple that weren't necessarily, I would say, abiding entirely by Islam. You had a lot of khalifas that were not necessarily abiding entirely by Islam. And certainly, if a person is not entirely abiding by Islam, they weren't going to battle for the sake of Islam. They were really battling for the sake of their own territory, battling for their own, basically power. So it becomes a personal thing and not necessarily in the name of the religion. But at the end of the day, of course, the Muslims are going to basically be within these battles. So some of those, I guess, al-Mutawakkil would be one person where he did not only harm the non-Muslims, but even the Muslims themselves. And I think many times the Orientalists would actually bring him up and speak about it as if it was basically resembling Islamic history, which is not accurate. There were times when, of course, you had certain khalifas that basically attacked one another. I mean, if you were to have a khalifa, imagine in the Ottoman Khilafah, in where if a khalifa were to basically be in power, all the brothers were going to get basically killed, assassinated, to ensure that there wasn't going to be a future division, or at least some of those khalifas in any shape or form probably going into some kind of a division, some kind of probably any future dispute over who's going to be the king, basically the khalifa. So they would kill the siblings, even if it was a baby. Imagine that. So yes, not always these times of our khilafah, not always was it too bright white, too full of justice, and completely full of justice. Let's say it that way. So sometimes definitely they might have actually acted not in the name of Islam, but sometimes they might have actually acted in their own name of greed, or their own basically, similar to what politics we would have today. It's basically in order to expand their resources, or probably attack others. So that, yes, even Muslims were sometimes also under this superpower that was abusing power. And of course, we could name some of those in where abusing power. Of course, we had a lot of khulafat that did abuse their power, but not in the name of Islam, really. It was really because of their own greed, because of their own injustice. And certainly, just like today, of course, you can have even a country like the US, who is basically considered right now as the superpower, and that's always speaking of protecting human rights and being concerned about human rights, but in reality, it's basically the one to, even against its own civilians. So you would have the highest rate of probably homelessness in America. Yet, of course, you've got all the money, which could end homelessness in America, actually be sent to another country, which is Israel. So it's really strange. Or even when we're talking about healthcare, all this money, if it were instead of giving it to Israel, which is a completely foreign country, in keeping it to the Americans that are paying their taxes there, and keeping it at least to their own nation. But then you could see that certain lobbies can actually maneuver the rights, and certainly what is actually is considered justice to their own people. So yes, you can have that. And Muslims are not necessarily infallible. We know that Muslims are not infallible, and they can also go through the same thing that other people are going through: their own greed, their own injustice, their own selfishness, and the list goes on and on. And of course, when you're in power, you're definitely going to be more, let's call it, susceptible to abusing the power and creating injustice. So just wanted to mention that one. Although, like I said, we would go back to the early times, at least until up to 41-year hijrah, and in order to help us know what Islam really says, in other words, the definition of Islam, to define whether Islam is jihad al-talab or jihad al-dafa'. But then, of course, it's going to be coming at us to learn about Islamic history, and we have to know all these details. All right, so this was at least this piece of it, and I think it's important to learn about it. Any questions before I jump from this topic to the other topic? I guess no questions. I think, how many people are interested in politics? Let's ask it this way. How many people, they really care about learning about politics and history and all of that? It's extremely important. Rehab, good job. Good job. Tell me about that, Rehab. Tell me about that, because that's very rare in women. And I think it's important that women would even learn about that, because this expands your horizon in knowing more about yourself, in knowing more about your deeds.
Sorry, can I just share something that my history teacher once taught me? He said, we should learn about history so we don't repeat the mistakes from the past.
Absolutely, that's what Winston Churchill actually said. That's actually very true. And of course, learning history is aqidah in Islam, because when you learn history, not only are you not repeating the mistake, but when you're learning history, you're basically making sure that you are planning for your future. You're planning for the ummah's future. Here, when you're learning history and you're learning politics, you are becoming a leader in order to help the ummah plan for a better future, plan for a better leadership. In other words, before we talk about right now in what's happening to the Muslims in Gaza, for example, we were supposed to be more awakened as an ummah. The more awakened we are as an ummah to basically speak about how weak we are politically / militarily, then we would anticipate and we would know what we're supposed to be, what power and what we're supposed to be enhancing, the areas that we're supposed to be enhancing before these atrocities and such atrocities would happen. These atrocities happened, and they were deemed to happen because, not because we didn't know about them, but because we thought that everything was safe. We thought everything was safe. So this is where this ayah was actually saying, خُذُوا حِذْرَكُمْ. You have to be alert. You have to be awake. You have to be warned. You have to gather the information and be careful from really being attacked without you even being prepared. So خُذُوا حِذْرَكُمْ is telling you, you got to be prepared. Gather your information, gather your intelligence. And that is learning about politics, that is learning about history, that is learning about those nations, what's going on economically, what's going on politically, what's going on militarily. All this is basically relating to the Muslim Ummah. So you really have to know this information. Use this time to learn about what is going on around the world in order to, before you end up saying, oh, we need to donate to the Muslims in this country or that country. Well, we weren't supposed to be doing it when the calamity already happened. We were supposed to have been prepared before the calamity even happens. That's what it means to be خُذُوا حِذْرَكُمْ. So learning politics, learning history is actually learning aqeedah. That's why if you look at the Quran is all full of teaching and telling us about the beginning of the beginning of Risala and what really happened. It was really teaching aqeedah right there. It was telling us that history and learning history and how, whether Fir'aun and what he had said and the narrative that he was using. Same thing when we're talking about economy and what was happening and and how they were abusing economy, and the same thing when you're talking about, for example, Qawm Lut, in where how they were basically putting in a narrative, an ideology, in redefining social justice, etc. Qawm Lut. When you're looking at Qawm Nuh, that they were actually abusing his weakness, or at least he said, "Inni maghlubun fantasar." And of course, basically what's happening there and how media plays an important role, just like in the story of Fir'aun. I guess the story of Fir'aun, the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam, was probably the most story that actually involved all the areas of, number one, the use of in abusing science and using science for power, authority, and of course media, military, politics, and all of that. I actually think the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam is rather the most interesting story of all times. The most interesting story of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would take us, like in Surah Taha, and then in Surah Al-Qasas, would take us into these different into these different stages, into these different areas, I personally think Prophet Musa's story is definitely the most interesting, the most it really gives me all the goosebumps to even see, how this baby, from being a baby that was supposed to be here, probably facing basically to get killed, to later on being guided to be right at the palace, the king's palace. And of course, عدو لي وعدو لك. خذه عدو لي وعدو لك. And here it is. This is عدو to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, an enemy to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, an enemy to Prophet Musa alayhi salam. But then he basically lands on right at the palace, right at basically the beach of that palace. And then who takes him? Well, the Pharaoh himself. But then ألقيت عليك محبة مني. Well, not only does he go inside the palace, but ألقيت عليك محبة مني. Even the queen falls in love with him. The king, the Pharaoh himself, falls in love with him. Everybody loves this child. And not knowing that this child, even when you look at love and you look at security, you could see that there is this guided area, this hidden power, this subtle power that is controlling the whole story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. It is, I don't know, it is just beyond controlling where this bassinet is landing, love and how it's affecting him. And then finally his sister basically comes and sees that, oh, they found my brother, and then brings the mother. And then this child is basically hungry, and they're trying to seek, of course they didn't have formula, so they're trying to find a woman to nurse this child and be the nanny for him. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised that And he would come back to her, and here she is, lined up, but because his sister basically told her mom, oh, they found him, why don't you just go and present yourself like you're the nanny that wants to nurse this child. She goes and presents herself, and then of course this child is not accepting any other woman. But then when he's lying in the lap of his own mother and start suckling from his mother, he's right there comfortable again and basically quiet. So this is an infant. This is an infant that doesn't even know any information, information. Who's this mom? Who's this lady? Who's this? He doesn't have any information, but it was a guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And where it tells you that love, affection, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our children be affectionate to us, make our children be those that would be obedient to us, obedient in khair, and make them also be those to support us when we need support. And Ya Allah, we also ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to also not give us a harmful elderly, or at least an old age. And we would say, متعنا اللهم بأسماعنا وقوتنا وأبصارنا أبدا ما أبقيتنا. Ya Allah, we would make the dua, Ya Allah, as long as we live, maintain وَجَعَلْهُ الْوَارِثَ مِنَّا, and maintain our health, our power, our eyesight, our hearing, and even, of course, our capacity, our potentials, as long as we live. وَجَعَلْهُ الْوَارِثَ مِنَّا, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give us this power. And of course, sorry, every time I think of old age, I don't know, it just takes me into a different world, because it's really scary when you become so vulnerable as an elderly. And even simple things, to use the bathroom, to clean yourself, your private moments, all of that, to get a sip of water, to eat, and when you forget everything, everybody around you, dementia, Parkinson's, all of those are or even the Alzheimer's, all of those are really, really sad. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep all such illnesses away from us. Ya Allah, Allahumma ameen, Allahumma ameen. When you had gone so old, and even your things that you once did not know, that you were not going to be able to do, something as small as holding a cup of water, or using the bathroom and cleaning yourself, or just remembering who you are and who's the person next to you. That, and if you have someone that is going through Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or any of those age-related diseases, please remember, this is basically your doorway to Jannah. Support your parents, support those that are basically going through this, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises you do any khair, it will be brought back to you. This is your door to Jannah. It is definitely hard when you have somebody with dementia who's probably slapping you, angry at you, thinking that you're stealing their money, or thinking that you're doing some kind of conspiracy and you're attacking them, etc. When what you're trying to do is really help them. So please be patient with them. Please, wallahi, this would be your doorway to Jannah. This would be your doorway to Jannah. Be patient, and remember, there's no way to get to Jannah if you're not patient. There's no way that you'll be. And same thing when your parents, I know that they can be stubborn when they grow older. They want everything their way. Be patient, even if they're not Muslim. Even if they're not Muslim, thank them at least for whatever they had contributed in your life. Thank them for every single thing that they had done to you. Just, that's it. That's all we could do. And we can make the dua, Ya Allah, right now, if whoever is with us, whose parents are not Muslim, Ya Rabbi, ishrah sadrahum lil Islam. Ya Allah, bring a guidance and their hearts open to Islam, whoever's parents are not Muslim here. Ya Allah, open and guide their hearts to Islam. Ya Rabb, Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. And Ya Allah, just as you had guided the heart of Abu Huraira's mother to become Muslim, Ya Allah, guide all our moms, those that, one, if they're Muslim, keep them steadfast. If they're not Muslim, guide them to Islam. And, I'm sorry. I guess I know I kind of went off track a little bit, but sometimes, it's just, you're, it just takes you somewhere else. All right. وَإِن مِّنكُمْ لَمَن لَيُبَطِّئَنَّ. Here we go. This is it right there. And from you, of course, we talked about this in where it's talking about the munafiqeen, and we said that, of course, yes, there was this order for jihad, but then some are going to be, and we said that here this is minkum, not to mean from you as the munafiqeen being part of the ummah, but this is that basically it's considering that they are part of the ummah, at least in and basically in the nation and ethnicity, or probably even in number. فَإِنْ أَصَابَتْكُمْ, now this is basically taking us into أَصَابَتْكُم, meaning the ummah, meaning the mu'mineen, sorry. قَدْ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيَّ إِذْ لَمْ أَكُمْ مَعَهُمْ شَهِيدًا. And this was basically here quoting the munafiqeen. They would say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed me that I wasn't with them, and or even killed, and even is a shaheed. And even though they didn't say, for example, lam akum ma'ahum, for example, qutilt or anything like that, no, they regarded that shaheed himself. Shaheed himself was basically a disgrace. And this is important to keep in mind, because when you look at sin, whether we're speaking about kufr or whether we're speaking about, of course, sin would be the highest, kufr would be the highest level of sin. But when we're speaking about sin, we're speaking about something that can influence the person's vision, the person's recognition of right and wrong, and their definition of right and wrong. What's the evidence? So number one, this is an evidence right here. إِذْ لَمْ أَكُمْ مَعَهُمْ شَهِيدًا. They basically saw, because of their hypocrisy, they basically had seen that the level of martyrdom or shahada was nothing but a disgrace. In other words, they saw it as a failure. They saw it as a way of basically of not a success, not a victory, not even in the akhirah, but nothing but a failure, nothing but a loss. Same thing when you look at Qawm Lut, in where Qawm Lut, when they expelled Prophet Lut alayhi salam, and they basically had mentioned that the reason for that is because they were seeking yatataharun, because they were seeking purification. So to them, seeking purification was nothing but a contamination. You could say sin had affected their ability to recognize, one, the definition of justice, two, the definition of morality, and even what makes something moral or ethical, etc. So they saw that was basically deserving nothing but a punishment. Okay, so same thing when you're looking today, just by practicing probably Islam or practicing your religion, that it's not strange, it's not unprecedented that you would be called a terrorist, that you would be called backwards, that you would be called somewhat of a person that is an outcast, or somebody that is an outlaw, whatever it is. This is not strange. This is not unprecedented. All right, but this was always the act of a hypocrites, the act of the kuffar. And same thing when you look at the act of the hypocrites, you want to keep in mind, when sometimes, you remember, minkum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, they can be part of the Muslim numbers. Their ID says they're Muslim, but the truth of the matter, and the fact is that these people, yes, they're probably part of our number, our population, but what they're actually doing is really just a dagger in the heart of the ummah. And they're the ones that are redefining the the Muslim Ummah, their principle, redefining, of course, what we stand for as an Ummah, and of course the ethical or the principles, the ethical grounds, and of course the moral standards within the community. Of course, they would be there. So you would see some that are called Muslim, but the reality is they're actually going against Islam. They're acting within our numbers. It could be a masjid even. It could be a masjid, and you're trying to put in perhaps some programs to teach Islam, and they're basically opposing such programs, and they're actually wanting to propose probably programs that are diluted or watered down Islam. They'll be the ones. They're basically here. They're part of the Muslim community. They're part of the Muslim board in the masjid, etc. But they're the ones that are proposing anti-Islam, literally or anti-Islamic indoctrination, basically activities, etc. And they're presented right there as Muslim. So this is exactly. So same thing when you would actually have even in MSAs or any Muslim lobbying, etc., you would actually have Muslims themselves. Right now, we're having Muslim organizations, what their job really is in order to bring about, I would say, the Muslims to lose their confidence even in their leaders. You'll find every once in a while we're going to have a woman claim that she was raped by this sheikh or that sheikh, etc. And I'm not saying that is impossible. I'm not saying that that's impossible. It is possible. He's not infallible. It can happen. But of course, if it went that far, why didn't she seek the 911? It was that simple. But of course, you could see it, unfortunately, you could see sometimes the Muslims can sometimes play this Me Too masjid, etc., and without them realizing, with no hikmah, they can actually then really work the opposite direction of the Muslim benefit. All right, this is not saying that it doesn't exist, but definitely, if something like that did happen, we should stand with the victim, definitely. But to make it seem like it's a Me Too message, it is where it's so widespread, etc., you will then realize that no, there is a munafiqeen agenda right there trying to bring about a division within the ummah. All right, وَلَئِنْ أَصَابَكُمْ فَضْلٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لَا يَقُولَنَّ كَأَن لَّمْ تَكُنْ بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَهُ مَوَدَّةٌ. So what would they say? So look at this one, لَا يَقُولَنَّ, right there. We said, and basically a parenthetical clause right there. لَا يَقُولَنَّ, what would they say? So this is what they would say. يَا لَيْتَنِي كُنْتُ مَعَهُمْ. So what would they say? Let me right there, just look at, help you see it. Okay, so لا يقولن, where's the word? Okay, here we go. لا يقولن, and what would they say? They would basically say, here we go. يا ليتني. So this is what they would say. This is the quote. Okay, this is the quote. What would they say? And this كأن لم تكن بينكم وبينه مودة is basically a parenthetical clause. So what would they say? يا ليتني كنت معهم فأفوز فوزا عظيما. When? Well, when the Muslims would basically be victorious in certain ways, or probably get some kind of a dunya outcome, or some kind of at least, I guess, success in getting some economical or at least financial success, they would basically say, I wish I was with them. What they were really concerned about was really to gain some kind of a privilege in dunya, not the akhirah. Now this is basically, it's kind of, okay, since you had learned the lesson of what a munafiq would be like, then for a believer, now it's teaching you. Now, learn the lesson. Don't be part of those. So that's when the ayah says, فَلْيُقَاتِلْ. So right here, what next to the star, what is the star for? So this star, let's look at it so you can actually see it and recognize what the star really means. Let's look at it right there. Here we go. So this is what it's telling you. This little star right here This explains it. It says ثلاثة أرباع الحزب, and this says حزب 9. Okay, so this is حزب 9, 3/4 of al-hizb. So the Quran is split into 60 juz'. Let's write it right there. Okay, so the Quran is split into 30 juz', 30 juz' and 60 hizb. Okay, hizb. So every juz' is 2 hizb. Think of it as a dosage. So 30 days in a month. So read at least 1 juz' per day, and you've got 1 dose in the morning and 1 dose in the evening. So 2 hizb, okay? 1 dose in the morning, 1 dose in the evening to finish all the Quran by the end of the month. So basically telling you that. So of course the ahzab and the ajza are not related to subjects, but they're related to amount, the amount that you had passed in the Quran. Basically just that. فَلْيُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يَشْرُونَ. So here, semicolon, now we're talking about the subject. فَلْيُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Then of course, this is al-khitab lil-mu'minin here. Basically, this is directed at the believers. So the believers, those that yashruna, the word yashri, in Lugha Arabiya, there are certain words that would mean a word and it's the opposite. So yashruna, the word yashri can mean to buy and can also mean to sell. Okay, can mean to buy and can mean to sell. So at the end of the day, it's a trade. Okay, and same thing. وَمِنْ وَرَائِهِمْ مَلِكٌ يَأْخُذُ كُلَّ سَفِينَةٍ غَصْبًا. In literally, it would mean, and behind them there's a king that would take every single ship by force. Okay, but this is not talking about behind them that there's a king. But مِنْ وَرَائِهِمْ مَلِك, this is talking about in front of them. So in Lugha Arabiya, you can use a word that can actually mean the total opposite. How do I know? The context. The context would tell me, or sometimes the compound word would tell us whether this is basically using the opposite of that word, the opposite meaning, or whether it is, in other words, whether it's the antonym or the synonym. Okay. يشرون الحياة الدنيا بالآخرة. So who are these? These are basically the mu'mineen. What does that mean? يشرون الحياة الدنيا بالآخرة. This is basically the bat right there. I want you to look at this bat, because this bat right there would actually mean what is left. So المتروك, الباء تدخل على المتروك. Okay, so يشرون الحياة الدنيا بالآخرة. Sorry, confused it here. Okay, so يشرون الحياة الدنيا, basically they would leave الحياة الدنيا and take الآخرة instead. Okay, they would take الآخرة. They would give up on dunya and they would basically take a dunya instead. All right. Sorry. Oh, I confused it again. All right. They would give up on al-hayat al-dunya. But the question is, what does al-hayat al-dunya even mean? Al-hayat actually comes from bringing in life. So life, ad-dunya means the lowest. Dunya means the lowest life. So al-hayat al-dunya, the lowest life. Bil-akhirah, so basically they're basically taking in al-akhirah, they're giving up on dunya and taking al-akhirah. Al-akhirah means the last life. What is the last life? Basically in Jannah. وَمَن يُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, and whoever is to fight. Now here's a question. Are we here just talking about al-qital to mean fighting, meaning in combat? So in this context, in these ayat, وَمَن يُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, yes, this is actually in combat. Okay, وَمَن يُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. What if I'm a woman? And of course, in Islam, women do not go in combat. In Islam, women do not go in combat. Women do not join the military unless the only times that they would join in military is if there is an attack, a direct attack. Then in that situation, hey, everybody's under attack. Whatever is in your hands, whatever you could do, go and defend yourself because you're under attack. And of course, the government is now not capable of defending you. So whatever you're capable of doing in basically protecting yourself, go ahead and do it. Okay, so that's the only time that women would join in military, is when basically engaging in direct self-defense. So that situation, that's different. But وَمَا يُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, and here, يُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, the context of it is whoever would basically would fight for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, فَلْيُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, here, this is not talking about the general meaning of jihad, the general meaning in where you're putting an effort towards a certain cause, but this is actually to put an effort, whether we're talking about one, it can be that yuqatil fi sabilillah, it could also mean to fight, meaning to really join in combat, and it could also mean an investment. In fact, there is a hadith for the Prophet ﷺ that that one arrow that somebody might actually hit, three people can be joined, and even more be joined within that arrow. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Somebody might be mending the arrow, another person might have actually paid the money to buy the arrow, and the third one actually targeted and was basically using the arrow. And same thing. So whether you are probably engaging in maybe the media, maybe you're using Instagram, you're using the media in order to protect the civilians, protect those that are vulnerable, etc. That's one way of using qital fi sabilillah. It's basically using that means. Or whether you're probably using a different means, you're right there really going in politics, you're trying to use probably your political power, or maybe your eloquent words, your ability to give good speeches, etc., in order to support the Muslims, or even, I guess, speak about Islam itself, etc. And then in that situation, using another type of an arrow. And perhaps another person might actually say, well, I don't know how to do any of that. I'm just a business person. I just know how to make money. I'm really good in business. So in that situation, your investment, you putting in that money to probably not only in battles or in fights, but also in probably spreading Islam. Maybe because that masjid is trying to buy pamphlets to spread Islam, or probably teach Islam, or probably have the people to teach Islam, probably the internet, and probably pay the teachers, etc., to make them continue teaching Islam, etc., or even the masjid, and etc. That's basically right there. That's qital fi sabilillah as well. It doesn't have to be an actual battle. So all of that is basically fi sabilillah. It's basically jihad fi sabilillah, in where you are investing for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here, and of course, because of the context itself, it is in فَيُقْتَلْ أَوْ يَغْلِبْ فَسَوْفَ نُؤْتِيهِ أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. So whoever would basically would be killed, meaning died as a shaheed, or وَمَا يُقَاتِلْ, sorry, وَمَا يُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, whoever would fight in the sake of basically the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning this is emphasizing al-ikhlas, sincerity. What is al-ikhlas? Al-ikhlas would be in different ways. Number one is that you're doing it only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Can I do it that I'm doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I'm also wanting to get a payment for it? I basically, it's a job. No, it has to be only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You cannot do it as, yes, I'm here just making money out of it. That would not be ikhlas. But can I also get paid for what I'm doing? Yes, you can get paid for what you're doing, and this does not necessarily contradict that it is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's say a person is let's say giving da'wah, okay, and they're giving da'wah, and at the same time they're basically getting paid for this as well. This is their job. Does this contradict ikhlas? No, it doesn't. Your ikhlas would be that you're doing it only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do I know if I'm doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You would know when, for example, if this money basically was stopped. Would you stop giving da'wah? Maybe your production would probably be less because you don't have the same amount of time, because you're trying to probably pay your bills, pay your rent, etc. But would you still do it? Would you stop if people didn't praise you for what you're doing? Do you enjoy it when people are just praising you for doing it? Or do you basically have the commitment? Whether people praise me, whether I got dunya or not, I still want to do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because I want to get Jannah. That is al-ikhlas. That is al-ikhlas. So, and فَيُقْتَلْ أَوْ يَغْلِبْ. So here, you could see this ayah right there, basically had considered it equal. So whether the person was killed as a martyr or whether they were victorious, that فَسَوْفَ نُؤْتِيهِ أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. They would still get a magnificent reward. You could see نُؤْتِيهِ, basically نُؤْتِي, أَتَى would basically mean to come. But نُؤْتِيهِ, we would, not to come, but we would give him. We would provide him. Okay, نُؤْتِيهِ. And that hat, the pronoun hat, basically نُؤْتِيهِ. What about women? Are they included in here? So speaking of which, a Sahabiya came to the Prophet ﷺ and she said, well, men get the privilege of joining in the battle. Men get the privilege of joining Jumu'ah, going to Jumu'ah, going to the congregational prayers. They get all these privileges basically to increase their level and their chances of going to Jannah, basically. We don't get the same privilege as women. I want you to look at this hadith. All right. I'm going to give you this hadith so you could see it. And all right, let's see. And I want you to see it. And this hadith, there we go. I want you to see it right there. Just open up with me. And I want you, there we go. So let's see. So basically this hadith, let's see, this woman comes to the Prophet ﷺ and she said, Ya Rasulullah, رب الرجال ورب النساء الله عز وجل. The Lord of the men and the Lord of the women is basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Adam is the father of the men and the women. And Hawa is basically the mother of the men and the women. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent you to the men and the women. But men, when they would go for the fi sabilillah and they would be basically killed, they would be alive with the Lord Almighty, and they would even get, the provisions. And if they were to basically go, they would get the reward of what you would know. But as for us, we're just here providing for them. We're just here really, and look at the word, نحبس أنفسنا عليهم. So نحبس أنفسنا is like we're caging ourselves. That's how she said it. She said we're caging ourselves. We're just really blocking ourselves. We're just really putting ourselves, really just keeping ourselves for them. We're basically at home trying to provide for them, trying to give them everything, but then, they go and they basically get the shahada and get the privilege. And here we're trying to just give them. فَمَاذَا لَنَا مِنَ الْأَجْرِ? Said it. Guess today, the feminists would actually regard, here's the first feminist. It's like, no, that wasn't the feminist. Let's see. She was actually saying, what rewards do we get? So the Prophet ﷺ said, فَقَالَ لَهَا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ أَقْرِئِي النِّسَاءَ مِنِّي السَّلَامَ وَقُولِي لَهُنَّ. Said, give my salams to the women. Ladies, it's giving you the salams to you too. Because it said, أَقْرِئِي النِّسَاءَ مِنِّي السَّلَامَ. So she was there coming, and she was more like a representative on behalf of women. So it seems like many women were having this conversation and we were really confused about this. And he said, and tell them, إِنَّ طَاعَةَ الزَّوْجِ تَعْدِلُ مَا هُنَالِكَ وَقَلِيلٌ مِنْكُنَّ تَفْعَلُ. That obedience to the husband would be equal to all of what men contribute, and very few women would actually do it. Let's see, this is isnadun jayyid. This is a good narration. In other words, when we say in hadith, good narration, it doesn't mean this is talking about a good story. This is not a descriptive word, but this is actually a classification. Okay, this is a classification in hadith to mean that the chain of narration is actually one. All the narrators in that chain of narration are basically of piety, of good memory, and that this most likely and most likely was actually said exactly by the Prophet ﷺ. All right, here is another hadith that pretty much gives pretty much the same idea, and that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, أبلغي من لقيت من النساء أن طاعة الزوج واعترافا بحقه يعدل ذلك وقليل من كنا من يفعله. So this one is actually isnadun ضعيف. This is a weak narration, and let's see that tell all the women that you come across that obedience to the husband and even admitting his rights is equal to all of that men would contribute, and very few women would do it, right? So at the end of the day, of course, when you're looking at that, somebody might say, well, wait a minute. So what about when you say obedience to the husband? Isn't that somehow being condescending to women? Why are we saying things like, yeah, obedience to the husband? Why can't we say it's a mutual respect? And instead of talking about obedience in where the man is like the master and the woman is basically somehow the inferior person that's there supporting the man, etc. Number one, the idea of obedience actually comes from the whole premise that he is al-qawwam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الرجال قوامون على النساء. Al-qawwam, or al-qawama itself, actually comes from the idea of one, to be in power, two, to be in responsibility, and three, to be in basically in support. Okay, so we're talking about these three areas. So he's an authority, and that's where the premise comes in. So if he's a qawwam and qawwama belongs to him, then at the end of the day, he's going to be the one in authority. If he's in authority, then he's going to be held responsible to provide for the family, to make the decisions for the family, and whatever goes wrong, he's the one that's going to be held accountable for it by at least 90% of the time. Number three, in support. To bring in support is basically to make sure that you're supporting everything that relates to the children, supporting even the wife. When we're talking about support, we're not just talking about financially, but we're also talking about morally. When she's feeling weakened, you have to be there to give that support. You have to be there to basically help maintain the whole household. So in that situation, in every single institution, so whether you're talking about a company, whether you're talking about any organization, any institution whatsoever, you're going to have basically the different levels. So you've got the CEO, you've got the president, you've got the executive director, you've got all these different people. Okay, so the executive director is definitely going to be taking the orders and the commandments from the president. All right, the president is definitely going to be beyond, at least in what orders, and certainly in the privileges and the power that they would basically have. All right, so therefore, the executive director is going to be obeying the commandments that the president would give. And that's the same thing. So where does this whole idea of just totally feeling that obedience to the husband, that somehow it is inferior, somehow it is disrespecting women, somehow it's putting women in a level that is condescending, etc. All right. So it really comes from the feminist ideology. The feminist, and especially Simone de Beauvoir, is one of the most important, I would say, godfathers of feminism. And she basically had put in all these proposals that marriage, and in fact, the feminists, that's what they stand on, that marriage is basically a woman's body, and marriage is what caused that women were not in power. Basically, the women's level is not equal to men was really because women were not participating in being the breadwinners. So it was number one, the plan was to get women outside of the house and let them become breadwinners. Number two, it was basically to get women outside of being within the control, or at least within the household, and outside of being under al-qawama of men, and in order to be your own qawam. In other words, she basically, the feminists, and specifically I would say Simone de Beauvoir, had actually written books regarding that marriage is nothing but caging women, and that her own body, if there is an opportunity to abort children, to basically somehow prevent women from getting children, that's a privilege, and that women should use it in order to gain freedom and liberty. So this woman, Simone de Beauvoir, is considered one of the main figures that right now is her ideas are right now indoctrinating many women, including Muslim women, in where to see that obedience to the husband is nothing but a disgrace, is nothing but making women feel that they are inferior and so forth. No, you're not inferior. Islam doesn't regard you as inferior. And obedience to the husband is not to mean you're inferior. Obedience to the husband is basically the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had instructed that a home in order for it to be one founded on good foundations, in order to have a home basically, let's say, complete in its administration, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarded that man, you need to man up, be the person in authority. Being in authority, it doesn't mean that you're abusing. That's not in authority, because this is not tashrif, this is taklif. This is not to give you an authority in order to give you some form of honor. This is not necessarily, and this is certainly not to give you honor, but this is to give you a taklif. This is to give you a responsibility. And same thing, if we're saying that the level of authority is not for an honor, then therefore the level of obedience is not for a dishonor. Okay, this is important. When we say this is taklif, that means it's a responsibility. That means this is another obligation on the man's plate, in where if he does not take it seriously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold him accountable, just like he's holding him accountable for his salah. This is important to keep in mind. This is taklif and not tashrif. Remember this word. Now let me write it down. Taklif and not tashrif. What is the difference? We just mentioned it. So let me write it right down. What page are we on? Okay, maybe I'm sharing the wrong page. Okay, here we go. All right, so the word is taklif and not tashrif. Let me write it down. Taklif, not tashrif. Taklif actually means it's an obligation. It's an obligation. It's basically a burden. Tashrif is honor. And of course, in Islam, such a position of qawama is taklif. It's an obligation. It's a responsibility. And it's not an honor. And the same thing, if we are saying that a man's level of being qawama is not a tashrif, but a taklif, that also means that right there, the women, by being obedient to the husband, of course, that basically reduces from their taklif, at least from being responsible for so many different things. So because he's putting all the responsibility on the man. Okay, and of course, it's not necessarily a dishonor by being obedient to the husband. So that's where we would look at it. And at the same time, of course, what brought in, I would say, an advancement, or I don't want to say an advancement, but what brought in more power to the feminists is really the contraceptive pills. And right now they're trying to bring in more of that by basically recommending and certainly making it legal to, and certainly encouraging abortion, because they see it as, well, children are nothing but uh, but um, uh, but a reason why women were not at the level of men in terms of money making and so forth, because she, that is, of course, Simone de Beauvoir and Elizabeth Kenton and all of those, they basically saw that uh, by making women be the breadwinners, leaving the household, that they're going to be equal to the men. And by equal to the men in money, in position, in power, etc., that basically would make sure and basically bring in a power to the women, and that's what would get them stronger.
Well,
When
just
in
look at
reality,
the households nowadays. You know how I'm talking about American society, how the whole family is, subhanallah, like
well,
just
absolutely. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically did all the legislature in Islam, obedience to the husband. And for example, in terms of the structure, it's basically to keep in mind that women's, one, biological differences, number two, psychological differences, and that these differences, if you were going to disregard them, that's abuse. To disregard such differences, that's abuse. The abuse is by asking women to be like the men when they don't have the physical and the biological and the psychological, at least, powers to do that. They weren't created to be in such positions. To ask them to be in such positions is to ask them more with them what they can bear. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was right there asking the women, ta'at al-zawj, obedience to the husband, is not as a tashrif, but is really to help you. It's like you don't have to worry about all their other stuff. If you're just capable of maintaining the household, that's a big enough responsibility. That's basically telling you you're doing a lot more at home. And this is right there telling you that Islam considers that the amount that you invest within the household, all the effort is going to be equal to all the effort that a man might do in combat, that a man might do going to probably Jum'ah, Jama'at, etc., that you're actually doing something even more at home. That's your contribution. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, don't need you to go and all those contributions. You're doing enough just by obeying your husband, obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being there for the family, trying to teach your kids, trying to clean the house. That's enough for you. That's a lot on your plate already. What more do we want? If that's seen as condescending, well, I sure enjoy, being a wife. I
I
enjoy,
really liked that explanation when you explained it in Arabic terms, you know, subhanallah.
oh, the tashrif and the taklif. I think it's important to see these points. Unfortunately, you could see it many times. The feminist narrative can sometimes, in Arabic we say, in Palestinian accent at least, and which actually means if you were to, let's say, a gunshot, you were to hit a gunshot, even if it doesn't hit the target, the sound of it blasts your ears. That's the same thing. It blasts your ears. And even if you didn't become feminist, you will see a lot of Muslim women are really influenced by that idea, just by the word saying obedience to the husband. They're right there. It's like, what? Why? And why am I going to be there? Why is he superior? It's like, no, no, he's not superior. And you're not inferior either. He's not superior. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ صَالِحًا مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى فَلَنُحْيِيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً. Whoever does good from male or female, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically bring them in the akhirah in a good life. It has nothing to do. Men are not superior, and neither are women inferior. At the end of the day, if you contribute good, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just laying out and putting basically these explanations and details explanations as to what suits your biology and your psychology, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lined out and outlined the social structure, just like the biological structure, and just like the whole structure with the social structure within the society. So this is not to say someone is inferior or superior. This is basically to tell you how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created your nature and how He created His nature and what the purpose of that was. That's basically it. You're just living the nature based on the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created the whole nature in. It's basically, you can't fight nature. You fight nature, you fight Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You fight Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you fight your own nature. It's gonna basically come back at you, and it's basically gonna break into your face. Who are you trying to face? You're gonna face your own nature? You're gonna fight your own nature? You're just gonna find yourself really putting yourself into what is harming you and not what is bringing good to you. Go ahead, my dear Maxi.
I have a question. You know, there's a hadith, the translation says, or the explanation of the hadith or whatever, I don't remember precisely, but it says that the man is superior in intellect, religion, and
No, there's no such
a
hadith.
third.
I know what you're talking about. That's a wrong translation.
Yeah, can you
So it's
tell?
not superior intellect. What you're talking about the hadith that Nisa basically ناقصات عقل ودين. That's what you're talking about. ناقصات عقل ودين, it's not superior in intelligence. نقصان العقل, the Prophet ﷺ explains what it means. Let me first use the wording. All right, maybe I could write that down so we could actually see what that looks like. Okay, so the word is ناقصات عقل. Okay, ناقصات عقل and ودين. Okay, so when you look at the word ناقصة, okay, I'm gonna put it right there, not over the Quran. Okay, ناقصة. So in naqs would basically mean to have something less. Okay, what is less? العقل is different than الذكاء. Okay.
Intellect, right?
No, this is not intellect. العقل is not intellect. العقل is determination.
Okay.
Okay, it's determination, because الذكاء would be intellect. Determination comes from the root عقل, which means to tie something. So when we say to tie something, that's determination. What does it mean to tie? It comes from the whole idea. Remember, we go back to go back to the root of the word. عقل, when we say اعقل وتوكل, actually means to tie something. اعقل means to tie it, actually fasten it. Okay, so fastening something. Okay, so al-aql here, that they lack determination in their decision making, in their choices, etc. So that's why she would basically need this in the hadith was really in the context of why women were basically ordered for certain things that are different than men. All right, so that determination, lacking the determination, was explaining why also women would need their wali, why she needs the wali. Okay, and at the same time, there is a hadith, there is the ayah basically in Surah al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explained that lack of aql, the lack of aql, the Prophet in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says why we need two women witnesses in comparison to one man witness, and the ayah and even the hadith was actually explaining it. It's basically because in order to, if one were to forget, the other one were to remind. So basically this is not saying that she lacks intellect, but the memory is slightly impacted by various physical things that her body goes through. maybe pregnancy, maybe hormonal changes, all of that. So that's basically that determination, and basically the memory is impacted. So that's where we don't basically just take, when in speaking about justice, when we want to advocate for someone, we need firm evidence. And that's the part that women lack. They don't have that firmness and in their memory compared to men. This is not because they're inferior, but this is in order to make sure that when we want to speak about justice, we want formidable and firm evidence, firm resources to make sure that justice is applied. So it's really to say that this has nothing to do with intellect. This has something to do with their anatomy. So this is their anatomy, and where they forget more frequently, especially with things that relate to numbers, etc. They would forget more frequently. Their psychological and their, of course, their neurological anatomy is completely different than men. So
yeah,
this,
we have
That's why.
we have
That's
more
why.
connections in our brain. You know, we tend to subhanAllah, like associate different things and connect different things to, you know what I mean?
right, right. So basically, when we're speaking about the anatomy changing, when we're speaking about the anatomy difference, we're talking about, of course, the impact, also psychological difference. So all of that buildup is going to have the impact. The other piece of it is basically nuqsan al-din. Nuqsan al-din, basically that women lack deen. This
Because
basically
we have a
was
period
also
and
explained by the
pray
Prophet
less.
that they would basically be exempt from prayer during their cycle, and even during their postpartum, exempt from fasting and exempt from certain religious duties. And that
Yeah.
eventually that has an impact. So we would basically have to work on our religious duties, and at the same time, just keep that in mind, that it does still have an impact. This is not, and by the way, this hadith, there is another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, ما رأيت من ناقصة عقل ودين أذهب بقلوب ذوي الألباب منكن. So this was actually seen as not necessarily as right there it is a dishonor, but it was actually seen that the Prophet ﷺ actually said, I have not seen women that lack aql and deen that are capable of having power over the men, ذوي الألباب, over the men that are considered as, the chieftains, those that are considered, somehow the big within the society, but then you as naqsa aql and deen, yet overcome many of those that are considered as not lacking aql and not lacking deen, and you're capable of having more power, and that is subliminal power within the society, within, of course, within even the men's area, in where, yes, you could be controlling your husband in a certain way. This is not to talk about controlling the husband to mean, a vicious controlling or some kind of, I'm here the boss, but this is actually to direct. So you're capable of using different potentials to direct it towards good. So even if you lack aql and you lack, let's call it lack determination, firmness, and or at least memory, you lack deen, maybe not the same religious, let's say, commitment that you might actually have, but you still can actually have a lot of contribution within the society. We'll end it right here, and we'll say, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those that would understand the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as they are taught, and make us from those that يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه, make us from those that would hear the words and follow the best of it and follow it in the best way, and make us from those that would basically hear what is haqq and apply what is haqq, and make us from those that would know what is batil and not do what is batil, or what is
we
evil.
need to learn Arabic, because
So
the
that's what we're trying to do.
translation is,
We're trying to break this down.
because the translation is tricky sometimes, and
Yes.
the real
Sometimes
meaning
it's
is
just flat out
lost.
wrong.
Yeah.
Subhanallah.
Yep, yep. Sometimes there are a lot of times where the translation could actually be completely off, and it doesn't do service definitely to the religion if the translation is wrong. And many times people would use, I would say, a literal translation, and the literal translation is way off and definitely bringing in more misconceptions. If you were to say that women, based on that hadith, they're superior in intellect. Well, what are you telling me? You're telling me I'm stupid. No, seriously, that's what you're calling me.
Yeah, yeah.
If this is what the religion would say, you're going to be saying, well, wait a minute, did the religion just call me stupid? And I'm here, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a wrong translation. That's a completely wrong translation. You have to go to the wording of it.
Yeah. Like it's word for word. Like there's the hadith and there's a little explaining under. It's like 2 sentences and it says the man is superior in intellect, in deen, and there's a third thing I don't remember. But then people stick with that, and then it's just that's what it is for the non-Arabic speaking Muslims. They
That's
take
why
that
Gems
and
of
they go with
Light
that.
is so important. Subhanallah.
Crazy. We have it's a come on, an obligation for us to learn Arabic, and that's why, inshallah, this is my next my next step.
Well, Allah يحفظكم يا ربي, إن شاء الله. Yep, inshallah, Ya Rabbi, we will continue. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. I actually have to leave, but if you all want to say, that's okay. But I will be ending, inshallah.